The silver forks clattered against porcelain plates, and then the sound stopped. A man's face turned purple, his eyes bulging, his hands clawing at his throat as though he were pulling at an invisible rope. A room full of dinner guests froze, helpless, watching the master of the plantation convulse at his own table. This is not just the story of a man gasping for air. It is the story of how a single desperate act would shatter the lines between bondage and power, creating a union so unthinkable that it would echo across generations. It was the spring of 1849 at the Marwood Plantation, nestled near the Yazoo River in Mississippi. The air smelled of roasted venison and tobacco smoke. The heavy oak dining table gleamed with polished silver. Judge Alistair Marwood, a man of 45 years with a reputation as stern as his starched collar, presided over a feast to celebrate the arrival of his northern business partner. His wife had passed years earlier. His household was ordered, his fortune vast, and his authority unquestioned. Until that night, halfway through a toast, Alistair's voice cut off. His breath hitched. He gripped the table's edge. A chunk of venison lodged in his windpipe, sealing his airway. The clock on the mantel ticked 7:42 in the evening. The music faltered, chairs scraped against the floor, but no one moved forward. Guests glanced at one another in horror. And then, movement. From the servants' quarters came a woman in a plain calico dress, her skin gleaming with sweat from the kitchen hearth. Her name was Eliza. At her side clung a small girl, no more than 7, clutching her mother's apron with wide, frightened eyes. Eliza saw the man choking and without hesitation ran forward, the hem of her dress brushing the waxed floor. She wrapped her arms around the judge's chest, thrust her fists beneath his ribs, and drove upward. Once, twice, a wet gag, and the hunk of meat flew free, skittering across the linen cloth. The room erupted in gasps. The judge collapsed into his chair, drenched in sweat, gulping air like a drowning man pulled from the river. His eyes lifted to the woman who had just saved his life. Eliza's hands trembled. Her daughter whispered, "Mommy, he's choking." Though the words came too late, the deed was already done. The clock chimed 7:45. Silence settled heavier than the Mississippi humidity. The master of the plantation owed his life to a woman who was not free, and to a child who should not have spoken in that room at all. For a moment, no one breathed. Then whispers began. How could an enslaved woman touch the master? How could a child speak out of turn? Guests looked to each other, then back to the man whose breath had nearly ended on the dining table. History often turns on seconds. Alistair Marwood wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and with a voice still raw, whispered, "You saved me." He said it not once, but twice, as though reminding himself of the truth. Eliza lowered her gaze. She had broken 100 invisible rules. She had dared to lay hands on a white man, had dared to act without permission. Every guest in that room knew what the usual punishment would be. Yet without her, their host would be dead. The venison cooled on the plates. The violinist set down his bow. Even the hounds outside the door seemed to hush. Something in the balance of that household had shifted forever. But rescue is never simple. What happens when gratitude collides with law? When compassion defies a system built on cruelty? Eliza had not thought of consequences when she acted. She thought only of a man's breath, a little girl's cry, and the knowledge that she knew what to do when no one else moved. But consequences were coming, carried on whispers like wildfire through the Mississippi night. The plantation that evening smelled of spilled wine and fear. The texture of the air was thick with unsaid words. Some guests would later swear they had seen judgment itself pass through that dining room. The story of Eliza and her daughter was just beginning. What would you have done? Stood frozen, watching, or stepped forward, knowing the risk? By the time dawn painted the horizon in pale pink, news had already traveled across county lines. The master had been saved by the hands of a slave, and not just any hands, but a mother's hands. The next act of this tale would not be survival. It would be scandal, because gratitude breeds debts, and debts demand payment. The night after the choking, the Marwood house lay unnaturally still. The cicadas outside hummed their endless song. The lamps burned low, and yet inside the walls, the air vibrated with something far heavier than insects or smoke. Gratitude and suspicion had become strange bedfellows. By morning, the gossip had already taken root. In the small town of Yazoo, men gathering at the general store whispered about it, lowering their voices as if the walls might listen. "The judge nearly died," one said, spitting tobacco juice onto the dirt. "Saved by one of his own slaves, a woman." Others chuckled uneasily, but the undercurrent was clear. This was not just unusual, it was dangerous. At the plantation itself, the atmosphere carried its own scent. Smoke from the cookhouse mingled with the tang of brass polish, while beneath it all lingered the sour odor of fear. Eliza moved through the kitchen with her usual steady grace, but every time another servant passed, their eyes flicked toward her and then away. Gratitude was not theirs to grant. They understood what her act might cost all of them. Judge Alistair Marwood, however, could not shake the sound of her daughter's cry. "Mommy, he's choking." A child's plea, simple and instinctive, had cut through the paralysis of adults who should have acted. He replayed the moment in his mind as he dressed for the day, fingers fumbling at his collar. Each memory carried the same weight. Without Eliza, he would be lying in the ground by now, mourned by men who admired him but envied his land. The stakes were no longer a single life. They were reputation, inheritance, and the law itself. At noon, he summoned Eliza to the study. The room smelled of tobacco and old leather, the heavy curtains drawn against the blinding Mississippi Sunday. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than she had ever heard it. "You broke the rules last night," he said. Eliza's pulse thundered in her ears. She lowered her eyes, bracing for punishment. But instead, he leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the mahogany desk. "And yet," he paused, as if even now struggling with the admission, "you saved me." Her daughter had been left outside the door, but Eliza felt the child's presence as keenly as the summer heat. She knew the weight of what had passed between them. The man who held her life in his hands now owed her his own. From a diary entry later attributed to a visiting cousin. April 5th, 1849. "I cannot shake the image of Alistair clutching at that woman as though she were salvation itself. I fear he sees her now with eyes unfit for his station." Stakes whispered through every hallway. The following Sunday at church, murmurs rippled through the congregation before the sermon even began. Some claimed Judge Marwood had spoken to the woman afterward with something like tenderness. Others said he had touched the child's head as they passed. Both actions, small as they seemed, were enough to unsettle every pew in that whitewashed building. And then came the silence of complicity. Guests who had witnessed the choking spoke of it only behind closed doors. The local physician, who might have written a simple medical account, instead said nothing. Even the judge's business partner, whose visit had brought about the fateful dinner, chose to finish his dealings quickly and leave town, muttering that he wanted no part in house affairs. What would you have done if you had watched it happen? Would you have told the truth? Or would you have folded it into silence like linen pressed into a chest? The weight of silence is heavy. By the end of April, new rumors sprouted. Some swore the judge had visited the slave quarters at dusk, his boots stirring dust in a place where he should not have been. Others whispered that he had promised Eliza protection from the lash. None could prove it, yet the gossip spread faster than cottonseed on the wind. Eliza herself carried on as though nothing had changed. She still rose before dawn, still mended torn shirts by candlelight, still sang her daughter to sleep with soft hymns. But inside she knew that change had already come. The look in Marwood's eyes was not that of a master toward a servant. It was something else, dangerous, impossible. One evening, the tension cracked into words. Alistair stood in the veranda, the scent of honeysuckle thick in the air, lantern light painting shadows across his lined face. "They think you should be punished," he told her quietly. "But how can a man punish the one who gave him breath?" Eliza said nothing, her daughter's small hand tight around hers. He looked at the child, then back at her. "If not for you, my blood would have ended with that meal. Do you understand what that means? It meant debt. It meant devotion. It meant a bond the law itself could not bless." The re-engagement loop deepened. What price would society demand for such a bond? By early summer, the whispers grew sharper. At the local tavern, a planter swore he had seen the judge hand Eliza a basket of peaches with his own hands. To others, this was proof of madness. A man of his standing risking his name, his property, even his seat in the county court for a woman bound in chains. And yet, one truth remained, undeniable. Every night when Alistair Marwood closed his eyes, he saw the darkness closing in, felt the air strangled from his lungs, and then the sudden rush of breath as Eliza's strength pulled him back from the edge. Breath is a fragile thing. As the Mississippi summer deepened, so too did the scandal. The household servants exchanged wary glances. The overseer muttered about unnatural affection. The neighbors stopped calling as often. By July, the Marwood plantation no longer felt like a fortress of respectability. It felt like a house with cracked walls, one storm away from collapse. One evening, Eliza found a folded scrap of paper slipped beneath her pillow. In careful script, it read, "We see what he does. Be careful. A friend." The handwriting was shaky, the warning chilling. Someone was watching. And then, in the last week of July, the impossible happened. Judge Marwood summoned the preacher. "I intend to take a wife," he declared, "and it will be Eliza." The words, once spoken, could not be undone. What happens when gratitude turns to love, and love turns to scandal? The river carried whispers downstream. The town braced itself. The law would not remain silent. And the wedding was set for August. Whispers had become shouts. The August sun bore down on the Marwood plantation like a furnace. Cicadas screamed from the trees, their steady chorus weaving with the distant thump of cotton bales dropped in the yard. Inside the big house, lace curtains trembled against faint breezes, but nothing could cool the air thick with dread. Everyone knew what was coming, yet no one dared believe it would actually happen. A white planter, a respected judge, was preparing to marry an enslaved woman. The stakes were nothing less than ruin. To cross the line between master and slave was to challenge the very architecture of the South's social order. To legalize it, to sanctify it under the eyes of God and witnesses, that was not scandal. It was treason against the world they lived in. Still, Alistair Marwood pressed forward. The scene that August 14th, 1849, was both simple and extraordinary. The parlor smelled of beeswax polish, candle smoke, and magnolia blossoms hastily cut from the garden. Their texture was soft against the humidity, but their perfume seemed almost suffocating, cloying in the crowded room. The preacher arrived reluctantly, summoned from the next county, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. He opened his worn Bible, but his hands trembled so badly the pages fluttered like frightened birds. He knew this union was a blasphemy in the eyes of his congregation. Yet the judge's authority and his fortune commanded obedience. Eliza wore no white gown. Instead, she stood in her calico dress, carefully washed and pressed. Her daughter clutched at her skirt, staring with eyes too old for a child of 7. Eliza's face was calm, but inside, her heart pounded with the weight of what this meant. Freedom, love, or a death sentence written in whispers. Neighbors did not attend. Only a handful of house servants bore witness, their faces masks of practiced neutrality. Some hearts beat with quiet hope after all. If the judge could elevate Eliza, might that mean more mercy for them? But others feared the lash of retaliation, the anger of surrounding plantations, the consequences of defying an unwritten law. The vows were spoken quickly, almost furtively. The preacher's voice cracked when he declared them husband and wife. Outside, the overseer spat into the dirt, muttering curses. The sun slid lower, and shadows stretched long across the porch, as though the land itself was watching. And yet, despite all the silence, despite all the fear, they were Wednesday. History pivoted on that moment, from a courthouse note scribbled later that month. August 19th, 1849. Report received of Judge A. Marwood entering into unlawful marriage with slave woman. Inquiry pending. Public outcry escalating. The backlash began within days. In Yazoo City, women whispered in sewing circles about the disgrace. Men muttered in the taverns, voices sharp with outrage. "He's lost his mind," one planter declared. "Marrying a slave woman? Might as well burn his fields himself." Others nodded grimly, knowing the judge's decisions in court would now be questioned, his verdicts tainted by scandal, and the gossip spread wider. By September, rumors had reached Natchez, even New Orleans. Letters arrived on Marwood's desk, some anonymous, some signed boldly, each condemning him. One reads simply, "You shame us all," but not every voice condemned. Among the enslaved across plantations, the story of Eliza traveled like hidden fire. A woman who had not only saved her master's life, but stood beside him as wife. To many, it was unthinkable. To some, it was hope. What would you have thought had you been there? Would you have seen love or betrayal, a miracle or a dangerous lie? The Marwood plantation transformed overnight. Eliza no longer slept in the quarters. She moved into the master's chambers, her daughter given a room of her own. For the first time in her life, Eliza's footsteps echoed on polished wood instead of dirt floors. Yet with each step, she felt the eyes of servants and guests alike. Freedom, in name only. Her presence at the dining table turned every meal into a battlefield of glances. Guests shifted uncomfortably, utensils clinking too loudly. Some refused invitations altogether. The household staff worked in silence, afraid their words might betray opinion. And yet, Alistair seemed blind or perhaps indifferent to the storm. He spoke to her openly, praised her judgment in matters of the household, even smiled in her direction. To him, it was simple. She had saved his life, and he had chosen her. The rest of the world could rage, but rage it did. By late autumn, the Mississippi press had caught wind of the scandal. Small columns hinted at impropriety and unnatural arrangements. In one newspaper, a scathing editorial declared, "If a judge cannot uphold the sanctity of our laws and customs, what hope remains for the rest of us?" The Marwood name, once associated with stern justice and unyielding honor, now bore a stain that spread like ink through water. Business partners withdrew. Court cases slipped away. Land values were whispered to have fallen. And still, Eliza endured. She endured the stares when she ventured to town with Alistair, his arm steady at her side. She endured the mutters of whore and witch hissed by passing mouths. She endured the fear in her daughter's eyes when men spat on the ground as they walked by. The dread grew heavier each day. In December, a letter arrived from the governor's office, politely requesting Judge Marwood's resignation. Though couched in legal language, its meaning was clear. The state could not tolerate his union. His reply, written in his own hand, was simple: "I will not step down. My oath was to justice, not to prejudice." That winter, the plantation felt like a besieged fortress. Snow dusted the cotton fields, rare but beautiful, yet inside the big house the chill was not from the weather. Servants whispered of men seen loitering near the gates. One night, a cross was burned in the distance, its light flickering against the black sky, and through it all, Eliza stood at his side. Her daughter's laughter, once bright, grew quieter. The child had learned too soon what it meant to be both cherished and despised. She clung to her mother at night, whispering, "Why do they hate us?" Eliza had no answer, but she held her child close, promising silently that their bond would not be broken by the venom of others. The cliffhanger came on January 2nd, 1850, when a rider delivered a final warning: leave Mississippi or be left in the ground. The choice was clear, but where could they go? The letter sat on Alistair Marwood's desk like a coiled snake. Its words, scribbled in uneven ink, carried more weight than any court decree he had ever signed. Leave Mississippi or be left in the ground. Outside, January frost clung to the bare branches of pecan trees, the air sharp with the smell of chimney smoke and damp earth. Inside, the judge's study felt close, suffocating, every sound amplified: the creak of leather binding, the scrape of a chair, the faint crackle of logs in the hearth. The stakes could no longer be ignored. This was no longer about whispers or editorials. It was survival. Alistair paced the floor, his boots striking the wood in measured rhythm. Eliza stood by the window, her daughter pressed against her hip, the child's small hand gripping the fabric of her dress. Eliza's face was calm, but her eyes betrayed the truth fear, not for herself, but for the little girl watching it all unfold. "You cannot ignore this," Eliza said quietly. Her voice carried a steadiness honed from years of endurance. "I will not be driven from my home," Alistair muttered. "This land is mine, my father's, his father's before him." But land meant little if the soil turned into a grave. That evening, the overseer quit without a word. By dawn, 2 field hands had fled, whispering of vengeance coming down the river. Even the loyal hounds refused to bark, as if they sensed danger crouched just beyond the tree line. From a surviving entry in the Plantation Ledger, January 6, 1850. Reports of night riders. 2 horses missing. Judge refuses to abandon property. Household unsettled. The dread spread like smoke through the quarters. Servants avoided the big house, terrified of being caught in the crossfire of their master's choices. And still, in the center of it all, Eliza moved quietly, tending to her child, preparing meals, whispering hymns under her breath. She knew what others would not say aloud. Every secret glance, every hushed conversation, every shadow that lingered too long near the gates carried the same message. They would not stop until the Union was destroyed. But what is a home worth when its walls echo with threats? By the second week of January, Alistair relented. "We'll leave for New Orleans," he told Eliza, his hand trembling as he gripped hers. "We'll sell the plantation. Begin again where no one knows us." The announcement rippled through Yazoo like a gunshot. The mighty judge fleeing. Some called it proof of his guilt. Others claimed relief. But for the Marwoods, it was the only path left. Preparations began at once. Papers were drawn up, trunks packed, valuables sold quietly to trusted merchants. Yet with every step, eyes followed them. One afternoon, as Eliza walked with her daughter to the well, a group of boys from town jeered, throwing stones into the dirt near their feet. "Ain't no mistress," one spat. "Ain't no wife neither." The words cut deeper than the stones. Eliza's daughter clutched her hand tighter, her voice trembling as she asked, "Mommy, why do they hate us?" Eliza crouched, her hands brushing the dust from the child's dress. "Because they don't understand," she whispered. "But we will keep walking. Always walking. Always walking." The family's departure was set for January 19th, but on the night of the 17th, the first true test came. It began with sound. Hooves in the distance, muffled but growing louder. Then the acrid smell of burning pine. Shouts carried on the wind. Men on horseback, torches in hand, circling the fields like wolves testing a fence. The servants bolted their doors, hiding in silence. Inside the big house, Alistair loaded his revolver, the metal cold in his palm. "Stay with her," he told Eliza, motioning toward their daughter. He stepped onto the porch, firelight flickering across his face. The riders did not enter the yard. They circled once, twice, then hurled a torch against the barn. Flames roared to life, sparks clawing the night sky. The horses inside screamed before bursting through the doors, manes ablaze, galloping into the darkness. The riders laughed, their silhouettes vanishing into the woods. When dawn came, the barn was a smoldering ruin. The acrid stench of ash clung to the air, seeping into clothes and hair. Alistair's jaw tightened as he surveyed the destruction. He knew then what Eliza had already accepted. Staying meant death. 2 days later, before sunrise, the Marwoods left. A wagon piled with trunks creaked down the muddy road, wheels sinking into frost-softened earth. Eliza sat beside her husband, their daughter bundled against the cold, her small face peeking out from beneath a wool shawl. Behind them, the plantation loomed silent, a house stripped of its legacy, its fields still smoldering with smoke. The road to New Orleans was long and treacherous. They traveled south through Jackson, where innkeepers turned them away the moment they recognized Eliza. They stopped in Vicksburg, only to find their wagon defaced overnight with the word "sin" scrawled across its side. Even in the bustle of river towns, they could not escape the shadow of their choice. From a New Orleans Tribune notice, February 2nd, 1850, arrived by riverboat, Judge Alistair Marwood and household. Reports persist of scandalous union. Public unease noted. The city greeted them with a roar of commerce, steam whistles, fish markets, the stink of river mud, mixed with roasted coffee and horse dung. For a moment, anonymity seemed possible in the crush of bodies and languages. Yet even here, eyes lingered too long, whispers trailed too close. The judge purchased a modest townhouse near the French Quarter. Its shutters creaked, its plaster cracked, but it offered something the plantation no longer could safety, or so he believed. Inside, Eliza tried to build a life. She walked the markets with her daughter, their baskets filled with onions and bread. She learned to navigate streets where French, Spanish, and English collided. But the air carried something else too: suspicion. Neighbors avoided their steps. Priests closed their doors. Even in the chaos of New Orleans, their union was a spectacle, and the threats followed. Anonymous letters appeared beneath their door. "You cannot hide in the city." Windows shattered in the night. One morning, they awoke to find a dead crow nailed to their gate, wings outstretched like a warning. What would you have done? Stay and fight, or run again? Eliza began to see the pattern. Each place they went, each attempt at peace, ended the same. The law might not chain her anymore, but hatred did. And hatred travels faster than any wagon. The dread grew heavier. By March, Alistair's health faltered. Sleepless nights, ceaseless worry, the collapse of his business dealings. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of choices made in love, but punished by the world. Eliza watched him with quiet sorrow, her hands cool against his fevered brow. And then, one evening, their daughter woke screaming from a nightmare. "Mommy, he's choking," she cried, thrashing in her bed. The words were the same she had spoken the night that bound their lives together. But this time, the choking would come from something no hands could dislodge. A society tightening its grip, determined to strangle them both. The knock came just before midnight, fists against the door. Voices demanding entry. The past had found them again. The pounding on the door rattled the townhouse shutters, each strike echoing through the plaster walls like a drumbeat of judgment. Midnight in New Orleans carried its own chorus, distant laughter from taverns, the bray of mules along cobblestones, the brackish scent of the Mississippi River drifting through narrow streets. Yet inside the Marwood home, the only sound was that relentless knock. The stakes had shifted from whispers and threats to confrontation. If they opened the door, they risked their lives. If they did not, they invited worse. Alistair Marwood rose from his chair, revolver in hand. His face, once known for its judicial calm, was pale, lined with exhaustion. Eliza gripped her daughter's shoulders, pulling her close. The child's breath came in short bursts, her eyes wide with the memory of fire and riders at the plantation. "Stay behind me," Alistair ordered. His voice shook. The pounding stopped. Silence. Then a voice, low but steady. "Judge Marwood, open the door. We need words." Alistair hesitated. He recognized the accent Natchez, a planter's drawl. A man who had once shared whiskey on courthouse steps, now standing as an enemy. "What do they want?" Eliza whispered. "Obedience," Alistair muttered. "Submission to their order." And he flow. He opened the door a crack. On the stoop stood 3 men in long coats, hats pulled low. The scent of rain-soaked wool clung to them. Behind, the flicker of torchlight revealed more shadows, a half circle of figures waiting in the street. "Judge," the tallest man said, his teeth glinting in the dark, "we're here as a courtesy. You know what you must do." Alistair gripped the doorframe. "If you mean my wife, the answer is no." The word wife hung in the air like thunder. One of the men spat onto the stones. "You shame your blood. Undo it. Send her away." Inside, Eliza held her daughter tighter. She could hear every word, each syllable a nail driven deeper into their fragile sanctuary. "What would you have done?" The question lingers even now. Open the door to violence, or stand firm against it. The men pressed forward. "We've been patient," the leader growled. "But patience ends tonight." Alistair lifted the revolver. "Step off my property." The street went quiet. Even the city itself seemed to pause, the distant songs of drunkards fading. For a heartbeat, it seemed the confrontation would erupt into blood. But then, a whistle cut through the night. Police lanterns bobbed at the far end of the street. The mob melted into alleys, boots clattering against stones until the darkness swallowed them. Alistair shut the door, bolting it fast. He sank into a chair, the revolver slipping from his hand. Eliza moved to him, her voice soft but resolute. "They won't stop." And she was right. The following morning, the market women whispered of men meeting in taverns, planning justice. The newspapers sharpened their ink, printing editorials denouncing unnatural unions. Even church sermons became veiled condemnations, pulpits warning against corruption at the heart of family order. The Marwoods had become a symbol, not of love, but of rebellion against a system unwilling to bend. From a clipped article in the New Orleans Picayune, February 12, 1850, scandal persists regarding the household of Judge Alistair Marwood. Citizens urge swift remedy, lest further unrest spread among the city's lower classes. The dread deepened. By March, neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. Shopkeepers refused service. Children pointed, whispering, "That's the judge's strange family." Eliza endured it silently, her hands busy with stitching and bread-making, her hymns carrying softly through shuttered rooms. Yet every note was shadowed by fear. Her daughter grew quieter. She stopped playing in the courtyard, stopped laughing. She asked fewer questions, save one repeated in whispers at night. "Mommy, will they take you away?" Eliza would stroke her hair and say, "Not while I breathe." But breathing was growing harder. The Marwoods' isolation thickened until the townhouse felt like a cell. Letters arrived daily, demanding Alistair's resignation, threatening violence if he refused. He burned them in the hearth, but the ashes could not erase their meaning. And then, one evening, a different letter came, delivered by hand. Its parchment bore no name, only a simple message. There are ships leaving every week. Passage north. Freedom lies beyond the river and beyond the states. Go while you still can. The handwriting was delicate, almost feminine. Eliza traced the lines with her fingers. Hope disguised as ink. But was it hope? Or a trap? The re-engagement question gnawed. Could escape truly offer safety? Or would the noose follow them even there? Alistair resisted. This is my land, my country. I will not be chased like an outlaw. But Eliza saw the truth. Their daughter's childhood was dissolving in fear. Their love was being buried alive under the weight of others' hatred. What good was land if it could not shelter them? The dread turned to inevitability. On the night of March 27th, as rain lashed the city and thunder rolled across the Mississippi, Eliza made her choice. She packed a single trunk clothes, her daughter's doll, a Bible with worn corners. She placed it by the door and waited for her husband to speak. Alistair stood long in silence. Finally, he nodded. We'll go. The cliffhanger lay in their next step. A ship northward, perhaps to Ohio, perhaps further still. But in leaving New Orleans, they would abandon not just property or status. They would abandon any shield of law, stepping into the unknown with only love as their guide. And rumor said the ship itself carried enemies among its crew. The rain had not stopped for 3 days when the Marwoods boarded the riverboat Magnolia Belle. The Mississippi churned dark and swollen, its surface whipped by winds that smelled of wet wood, mud, and the faint bitterness of coal smoke. The decks glistened slick beneath lantern light, the sound of water lapping against hulls steady as a heartbeat. The stakes now were escape itself. Every hour on the river meant distance from New Orleans and from the men who wanted their marriage erased. But every hour also carried risk. Betrayal, recognition, or a mishap engineered by those who had followed them aboard. Eliza held her daughter close as they climbed the narrow gangway. The child's shoes squeaked with each step, her eyes wide at the towering chimneys spitting sparks into the night. Alistair carried their single trunk, his shoulders hunched not from its weight, but from the weight of eyes. Passengers stared openly, a judge in fine coat, a black woman at his side, and a child who carried both of them in her features. Some faces showed curiosity, others contempt. Inside the main cabin, the air was thick with pipe smoke and boiled coffee. Cards slapped on tables, coins clinked, and laughter rose too loud to mask the shift in tone when the Marwoods entered. A hush spread for a heartbeat, then voices resumed, softer now, edges sharpened with whispered words. From a diary entry of a fellow passenger, March 29, 1850. They boarded late. A strange trio. A man of stature, a woman dark of skin, and a child between. It set the room uneasy. I feared trouble brews. Eliza and her daughter were assigned a narrow berth near the bow, its straw mattress smelling of mildew and damp wool. The walls wept with condensation. Still, Eliza tucked the girl in, humming a hymn that rose above the thrum of paddle wheels. Outside, rain drummed steady against the deck, a sound both soothing and foreboding. Alistair paced the corridor, his hand never far from the revolver beneath his coat. We're safer moving than waiting, he muttered, though his eyes betrayed doubt. The first 2 days passed in tense monotony. The boat stopped at small river towns Baton Rouge, then Natchez taking on wood and passengers. At each stop, curious stares burned holes in their backs. Once, a drunken planter asked too loudly, "What kind of judge keeps company like that?" His companions hushed him, but the words lingered in the air like smoke. Dread is heavy when carried on water. On the third evening, as twilight bled across the river, the first true sign of danger came. A note slipped beneath their cabin door. "She belongs to us. The law will not protect you upriver. No signature, no handwriting Eliza recognized. Just the words, stark and cold. She showed it to Alistair. His jaw tightened. They're on this boat. That night, sleep came only in snatches. The child whimpered, clutching her doll. Eliza lay awake, listening to footsteps creak overhead, to the murmur of voices beyond the thin plank wall. Every groan of timber, every splash against the hull, sounded like warning. What would you have done trusted the safety of the crowd, or prepared for betrayal in the dark? At dawn, the boat stopped at Vicksburg. The air smelled of wet clay and fried catfish sold by vendors on the docks. Passengers bustled off, but Alistair kept his family aboard, fearing a trap in the crowd. He stood watch on the upper deck, scanning faces, while Eliza kept their daughter below. It was near noon when the incident struck. A man in a long coat brushed past Eliza in the corridor. His hand lingered too long against her arm, his voice low. "A woman like you ought to know her place." Eliza recoiled, pulling her daughter behind her. The man smirked, tipping his hat before vanishing into the crowd of passengers. That evening, Alistair confronted the captain. "There are threats against my wife," he said, voice clipped. "Do your duty." The captain, a wiry man with tobacco-stained whiskers, shifted uneasily. "Judge, I run a boat, not a courtroom. Best you keep quiet, finish your voyage, and step off in Ohio. Till then, I'll not see trouble on my decks." But trouble was already aboard. The re-engagement loop tightened. Would their enemies strike before the river carried them far enough? 2 nights later, the Mississippi boiled with storm. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolling like cannon fire. Rain hammered the decks, the scent of ozone sharp in the air. Passengers huddled in prayer or drink. Eliza sat with her daughter in their berth, the hymn on her lips nearly drowned by the storm. Then screams. A shout carried down the corridor. Fire! Smoke curled beneath the door, acrid and choking. The child coughed, her eyes wide with terror. Eliza grabbed her hand, pulling her into the chaos. The corridor seethed with passengers rushing for the stairs, faces pale in lantern glow. Flames licked at the aft deck, sparks carried by the storm's wind. Alistair appeared through the smoke, revolver in hand. "This isn't accident," he shouted. "They've set it." The 3 fought their way to the upper deck, rain pelting their faces, fire roaring behind them. Passengers screamed, some leaping into the black river below, swallowed by its furious current. Crewmen battled the flames with buckets, but the blaze spread too fast. And then, through smoke and rain, Eliza saw him. The man in the long coat, standing by the railing, a torch in his hand, grinning through the storm. Her breath caught. Their enemies were not shadows. They were flesh and blood, and they were here. What would you have done? Confront him or flee? Alistair lunged, but the storm surged, the deck pitched, and in the chaos, the man vanished into the dark. The fire was finally contained, the damage confined to the aft cargo. The boat limped onward, its passengers shaken, some injured, all whispering of sabotage. But Eliza knew. This was only the beginning. By the time the boat reached Memphis, the air was thick with suspicion. Crews searched for the arsonist but found nothing. Passengers avoided the Marwoods entirely, as though proximity itself invited danger. The dread grew unbearable. That night, Eliza pressed her daughter close, whispering the same words again and again. "We will not break. We will not break." Yet in her heart, she feared otherwise. As the boat pulled north, Alistair confessed his terror. "We may never find peace. If they hunt us this far, what hope lies ahead?" And Eliza, staring into the dark river, whispered back, "Hope is all we have." But hope is fragile. On April 2nd, as dawn broke over the Mississippi, a pistol cracked across the deck. The bullet was meant for Alistair. The shot rang out sharp as lightning, splitting the April morning. Passengers froze mid-step. Deckhands dropped their ropes, and the great wheel of the Magnolia Bell churned on as if oblivious to human terror. The air smelled of river mist, damp hemp rope, and the sulfur tang of gunpowder. The stakes had turned lethal. Until now, there had been warnings, fire, whispers. Now there was blood. Alistair Marwood staggered, clutching his shoulder. The bullet had torn through the flesh just above his heart, spinning him sideways into the railing. Gasps rose from passengers who quickly melted away, unwilling to be caught in the blast radius of scandal. Eliza screamed his name, rushing forward with her daughter at her side. Blood seeped hot through his coat, staining her hands as she pressed against the wound. The girl cried, her voice breaking the morning silence. "Mommy, help him!" Crewmen scattered in confusion. One shouted, "Find the shooter!" Another hissed back, "Best not, ain't our fight." And just like that, complicity cloaked the deck. What would you have done? Helped, or looked away? Alistair's lips moved, his breath ragged. "Not fatal," he muttered, though his face betrayed pain sharp enough to stagger an ox. Eliza pulled at his coat, tightening a strip of cloth across the wound. Her hands were steady, the same steadiness that had saved him once before at that cursed dinner table. Passengers whispered from a distance, watching but not acting. Some muttered prayers, others sneered. A woman shook her head, saying, "God punishes sin." The shooter was never found. A shadow melting into shadows, aided by silence. The Magnolia Bell pushed onward, its paddle wheel slapping water as if nothing had happened. Alistair was carried below, placed in a cramped berth that reeked of tar and damp wood. Eliza sat beside him, her daughter curled in the corner, whispering hymns through tears. From a surviving passenger letter, April 2nd, 1850, there was a gunshot on deck. The judge fell. His wife, if she can be called that, tended him with fierce devotion. Many of us avoided their cabin afterward, fearing more violence. It is said the bullet missed his heart by inches. Providence, some call it. Others call it folly. The dread only deepened. Days passed in a haze of fever. Alistair drifted in and out, whispering half-formed sentences, fragments of law, names of ancestors. Eliza's name repeated like a prayer. She cooled his brow with river water, held his hand through tremors, sang softly when the pain racked him. Her daughter never left her side. The child's eyes had grown too old for her years, watching death crouch near her father's bed. And still, whispers carried through the boat, that the judge's wound was divine judgment, that his wife's care was a mockery of marriage, that perhaps someone should finish what the bullet had failed to do. One night, Eliza heard footsteps pause outside their door. A whisper, "We should end it." Another voice, "Not here. Too many eyes." The footsteps receded, leaving only silence. Hope became fragile glass. By April 6th, the boat reached Cairo, where the Mississippi met the Ohio. There, Alistair made his decision. His voice was weak but firm. "We go north, all the way north. Only there can we, breathe." The gamble was desperate. Free soil lay beyond, but danger shadowed every step. Slave catchers prowled borders, mobs stirred even in northern towns. Still, it was the only path left. At Cairo, they transferred to a smaller steamer bound upriver. The air was colder now, sharp with spring frost, carrying the smell of wet pine and coal smoke. Eliza's daughter shivered, wrapped in her mother's shawl. Alistair leaned heavily on a cane, his shoulder bandaged, his face drawn but resolute. Passengers eyed them as before, some curious, some cruel. A child pointed and asked his father, "Why's that man with her?" The father yanked him away, muttering, "Don't stare at filth, filth." The re-engagement loop tightened. How much longer could love withstand the acid of hate? One evening near Paducah, as the sun bled red across the river, Eliza took her daughter on deck for air. The girl leaned against the railing, her small fingers brushing the wood. "Mommy," she whispered, "will we ever be safe?" Eliza bent close, her lips brushing her daughter's hair. "One day, when we're far enough away. But how far is far enough?" That night, Alistair sat upright for the first time since the shooting. His face was pale, but his eyes held clarity. He looked at Eliza, his voice low. "I'd do it again. Every choice, even if it kills me." She clasped his hand, her own eyes burning. "Then we keep walking, until the end." Until the end. The Ohio carried them further north, past bluffs where fog clung to the rocks, past towns where church bells tolled across the water. Yet every tolling bell sounded like a warning. On April 12th, they docked at Louisville. The city smelled of brewing hops, wood smoke, and damp stone. Here, rumors caught up with them again, whispers in taverns of the judge and his negress. Men pointed, following at a distance. One night, as they lodged in a small boarding house, a stone crashed through their window. Wrapped around it, a note: "Turn back, or be buried here." The dread became suffocating. Eliza pressed the stone to her chest, feeling its weight. Not just a rock, but a verdict. She looked at Alistair, then at her daughter sleeping fitfully on the cot. "We can't stop," she whispered, and Alistair, pale beneath lamplight, whispered back, "Then we won't." But the next morning, as they prepared to leave, their host warned them, "There are men asking questions. You're not welcome here." So they boarded again, the river carrying them northward, each mile both salvation and noose. The cliffhanger struck on April 15th, as dawn spread gold across the Ohio. Eliza rose to find her daughter gone. The morning sun poured over the Ohio River like molten gold, glinting off ripples as the steamer's wheel churned steadily north. The smell of wet wood and coal hung in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of spring blossoms drifting from the riverbanks. Yet inside the cramped berth, the air was ice. Eliza's daughter was gone. The stakes had never been higher. Everything they had endured the fire, the bullet, the whispers, meant nothing without the little girl who had once cried, "Mommy, he's choking," and tied their fates together. Eliza tore through the cabin, flinging blankets aside, calling her name in a voice sharp with terror. Alistair, still weak, forced himself upright, cane clattering to the floor. "Check the deck," he rasped. Eliza sprinted into the corridor, her bare feet slapping against damp planks. Passengers turned, startled, as she shouted, "Where is she? My child, where is she?" Faces shifted away, eyes lowering. Some shook their heads, some smirked. Not one lifted a hand to help. What would you have done? Would you have searched for a child or stood aside, convinced it wasn't your business? Eliza rushed up the narrow stairwell, lungs burning. On deck, the wind whipped her hair, the river's smell sharp and metallic. She scanned the crowd. Gamblers hunched over cards, women in bonnets whispering, deckhands coiling ropes. No child. Then something. A scrap of fabric fluttering near the bow. Her daughter's shawl, caught against the railing. Eliza's stomach dropped. She seized it, pressing it to her face. Still warm. "She was here," she cried. "She was here." Alistair staggered up behind her, face pale. "Search the holds," he ordered the crew. "Check every cabin." His voice carried the authority of his old bench, but the men hesitated. One spat tobacco into the river. "Not my concern, Judge. Keep your own." Silence of complicity. Again, Eliza's chest heaved with fury. She seized a lantern, storming toward the lower decks herself. The air grew thick with the stench of tar, fish, and damp rope. Shadows twisted in the flicker of light. From a file note scrawled years later in Cincinnati, April 15th, 1850. Record of disturbance aboard river steamer. Reports of missing child. parents involved in scandalous union, no child found aboard. She searched every corner, storerooms stacked with barrels, bunks filled with snoring laborers, corridors echoing with dripping water. Nothing. When she returned to the deck, her face was streaked with soot and sweat. "She's not there," she gasped. Alastair's eyes scanned the river. The wide, merciless Ohio rolled past, carrying logs, debris, secrets. "She may have fallen." "No!" Eliza screamed. "No, she wouldn't." Someone took her. The re-engagement loop snapped taut. Was this an accident, or a kidnapping meant to end them once and for all? A passenger stepped forward, then a woman with kind eyes, her shawl pulled tight. "I saw a man leading her toward the stern just before sunrise. He said she was lost. I thought he was kin." Eliza's blood turned to ice. They ran to the stern. Empty barrels, ropes coiled like snakes, the smell of grease and steam. No child, only the faint imprint of small shoes and sawdust leading toward the gangway. By the time the steamer docked at Louisville, the girl was gone. Eliza collapsed on the deck, clutching the shawl. Her wail cut through the chatter of disembarking passengers, raw and unbroken. Alastair stood motionless, his cane trembling, his jaw locked. The crew dispersed. Passengers walked past. Some shook their heads in pity, others in scorn. Not one stayed to comfort. From that moment, the marriage ceased to be scandal. It became tragedy. Days turned into weeks of searching. Alastair paid informants, posted notices, bribed constables. Eliza combed markets and alleys, her voice hoarse from calling her child's name. They heard rumors. A girl fitting her description seen boarding a wagon headed south. Another claimed she'd been sold across the river. Each lead ended in silence. The dread was no longer whisper. It was a scream. In May, Alastair collapsed from exhaustion. His wound, never fully healed, had festered under strain. Fever consumed him, and he died clutching Eliza's hand. His last word, her name. She buried him in an unmarked grave on the outskirts of Cincinnati, the spring earth smelling of wet clay and lilacs. Alone, she stood with only her shawl and her grief. Eliza searched for her daughter until her dying day. Some say she found her. Others say the child was lost forever, swallowed by the same river that had carried them north. Still others whisper of a woman in Cincinnati years later, her hair the same shade as Alastair's, singing hymns that only Eliza had known. Legend lingers, even now, in old river towns along the Ohio. Some claim to hear a woman's voice at dawn, calling a child's name across the water. "Where are you? Where are you?" And they say, if you listen close, you can hear a child's voice answer back. The Ohio River rolled on, as it always had, broad, brown, and indifferent, long after the steamer Magnolia Belle vanished into memory. Yet in its currents lingered the ghost of a woman's cry and a child's absence that could never be filled. The stakes, once about scandal and survival, had distilled into something raw, legacy. Would Eliza and her daughter be remembered as people or erased as shame? In Cincinnati, Eliza lived like a shadow. The city clanged with iron foundries, smelled of smoke, wet stone, and horse sweat. Crowds surged through markets, their voices a dozen tongues. Among them, Eliza walked, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes scanning every face for her missing child. Some nights she scoured the docks, searching wagons bound south. Other nights she slipped into taverns where slave catchers drank, listening for scraps of rumor. Once, she overheard a man brag, "Picked up a pretty little girl by the river, sold her before dawn." Eliza's hand shook as she gripped her cup, but she never found proof. From a church record, June 8, 1850, a woman named Eliza attended service, asking prayers for her lost child. Congregation silent. Minister later said, Her presence brought unease. The silence of complicity had followed her north. By autumn, whispers of her search spread. Some said she was mad, seeing her daughter's face in every child. Others said she was cursed, a punishment for the sin of her marriage. But a few quietly, cautiously called her a symbol. Among abolitionist circles in Ohio, her story gained power. A judge, once part of the system, undone by love. A woman, once enslaved, refusing to yield. A child, torn between worlds. They spoke of it in parlors lit by oil lamps, voices low but fierce. "This is why slavery cannot stand," one said. "It swallows families whole." What would you have thought, hearing it then? A cautionary tale or a call to arms? Eliza herself cared little for politics. She cared only for the echo of her daughter's voice. Each dawn, she returned to the riverbank, the mud cold beneath her feet, her breath white in the air. She called the name, again and again, until her throat was raw. Always the same silence in reply. Breath is fragile. By 1853, time had carved its toll. Eliza's hair streaked with gray, her steps slowed. Yet she never ceased searching. She took work as a laundress, her hands red from lye, her back bent. Each coin she saved went to notices, to bribed officials, to journeys that led nowhere. And still, rumors persisted. A letter surfaced in Pittsburgh, claiming a child with light eyes and dark hair had been seen in a trader's camp. Another from Illinois described a girl singing a hymn known only in the Marwood household. Each lead rekindled Eliza's fire. Each disappointment left her hollow. From an abolitionist pamphlet, 1855, we know of a woman who walks the river each morning. She has lost much, yet she does not cease. Her story is our story. That slavery devours, but love endures. Endurance became her monument. In the years that followed, Eliza grew into a figure of whispered legend. Children dared one another to watch for her at dawn, to hear her voice over the Ohio. Dock workers told tales of a woman in a faded shawl, eyes searching every boat. Some said she had bargained with the river itself, trading her soul for the return of her child. Others swore the girl had grown, hidden under another name, waiting for the day they might reunite. But truth blurred with rumor. The re-engagement question lingered. Was her daughter alive, or had the river taken her long ago? In her final years, Eliza lived in a small boarding room above a seamstress shop. The air smelled of fabric dye and starch, the walls thin enough to hear the city's heartbeat. She kept a candle burning each night, its flame steady against the dark. One winter evening, a knock came at her door. A young woman stood there, hair dark, eyes pale. She said she was looking for work, but when Eliza's gaze met hers, something passed between them, recognition or hope disguised as it. Neighbors claimed they heard Eliza weep that night, long and unbroken. Some swore it was her daughter returned. Others insisted it was only a stranger, her grief painting a mirage. Legend refuses certainty. Eliza died in 1860, the year the nation itself began to tear apart. She was buried in a small cemetery by the Ohio, her grave marked only with her first name. No child stood at her side. No kin claimed her. Only the river witnessed her last breath. And yet her story survived. Abolitionists retold it as proof of love stronger than law. Former slaves whispered it as warning and hope. And along the river, even now, old men tell children, listen at dawn. You might hear her calling, and if you do, answer her, or she'll keep walking the banks forever. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.